January 11, 1944. Somewhere above the frozen fields of central Germany, the morning sky trembles under the weight of 100 engines. Frost clings to the plexiglass nose of a B-17G as the bomber holds tight in the middle of the formation. The safest place, commanders always said, if such a place truly existed at 25,000 feet. Inside, the crew breathe in short, controlled bursts. Oxygen masks hiss softly. The aircraft shudders as the slipstream knifes along the wings. Below them, the distant earth is pale and blurred, almost peaceful. But ahead, thin black specks rise like sparks against the blue. At first, they seem harmless, drifting upward with the grace of birds. Then the radio crackles, a single clipped warning. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. The specks grow rapidly, resolving into the hard angular shapes of FW-190s climbing straight toward the lead combat box. Their cannon flash even before the gunners can swing their guns onto them. The first shells burst among the fortresses, scattering shards of aluminum into the slipstream. And as the German fighters slice through the formation, the myth of the fortress's invulnerability meets the cold reality that would shape everything that follows. By the winter of 1943-44, the air war over Europe had become a contest of endurance more than firepower. The United States 8th Air Force, newly matured and steadily reinforced, was committed to the doctrine it had carried across the Atlantic: daylight precision bombing. It was a doctrine shaped in the interwar years by officers who believed that heavily armed bombers, flying in disciplined formations, could punch their way to targets deep inside enemy territory without the need for constant escort. They believed in the promise of speed, altitude, and overlapping defensive guns, a moving fortress wall of .50 caliber fire. The B-17 had been the physical embodiment of that confidence. Its 9 to 10 crewmen were arranged around a machine designed to survive damage that would cripple lesser aircraft. Self-sealing tanks, armor plate, and eventually up to 13.50 caliber guns gave the aircraft a reputation that far outpaced the reality of combat. Newspapers in the United States printed dramatic stories of B-17s returning with chunks of wing missing or engines shot out. Wartime propaganda embraced the Flying Fortress name, presenting the bomber almost as a weapon immune to defeat, a steel giant that could impose American will on distant targets. But in Europe, this myth collided daily with the evolving strengths of the Luftwaffe. When the 8th Air Force began serious offensive operations in the summer of 1943, German defenses were already hardened by years of fighting the RAF at night. Radar chains lined the coast. Fighter bases were positioned in layers stretching from France deep into Germany. Bf-109s and FW-190s could be scrambled quickly and directed into the bomber streams with precise timing. Ground controllers tracked incoming raids and vectored fighters for coordinated, head-on attacks, the angles that inflicted the most damage. The USAAF crews learned quickly that the sky above the Reich was a place where small errors became fatal. Engines froze if the wrong procedure was followed. Oxygen failure at altitude incapacitated crews in minutes. The bitter cold made metal brittle and gun mechanisms sluggish. Unlike the RAF, who attacked at night to avoid fighters, American bombers flew in broad daylight. It gave them accuracy, but it also made them visible from dozens of miles away. Still, strategic pressure demanded results. Aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, transportation hubs, the Allies needed them hit, and hit hard. Precision bombing was intended to cripple Germany's ability to sustain a long war. And so, mission by mission, the bomber groups pressed deeper into enemy airspace. They rehearsed tight formations, drilled gunnery teams to cover each other's arcs, and trusted that massed fire would break up attacking fighters long enough to survive, until the target passed under the bomb bay doors. Formation doctrine became almost sacred. The combat box placed aircraft at staggered altitudes and side-by-side spacing so that machine guns overlapped in a protective sphere. In theory, it worked. A single bomber was vulnerable. A well-flown formation of 18 or 24 could generate a crossfire so dense that German pilots often remarked on the suicidal nature of some attack angles. Early raids showed flashes of this promise. Fighters driven off, bombers returning home with minimal losses, commanders encouraged. But the strategic situation was not static. The Luftwaffe adapted rapidly. They increased the armor on their fighters, added heavy 20mm and 30mm cannon, and developed new head-on attack tactics designed to exploit the narrowest defensive arcs of the B-17. They coordinated in waves, the first to scatter the formation, the second to strike wounded stragglers, the third to finish the survivors on the long flight home. German commanders understood the psychological impact of forcing a bomber out of formation. Once isolated, even a flying fortress with 16 guns became little more than a slow-moving target. That was the truth American crews discovered as the campaign intensified. The B-17 was powerful, but not invincible. Its armor stopped small arms fire and sometimes cannon fragments, but direct hits from 20 or 30 shells tore open the fuselage, shredded control cables, or ignited fuel tanks. The guns were potent, but only when every position was manned, clear, and working. High cold could jam actions. Frostbitten fingers could not clear stoppages. A gunner slumped from hypoxia, left a blind spot, instantly exploited by incoming fighters. This was the environment the 8th Air Force entered as 1943 gave way to 1944. A sky defined by the clash between doctrine and reality, belief and adaptation, courage and consequence. And the deeper the bombers pushed, the more those contradictions would reveal themselves. It was within this escalating tension that the next layer of context unfolded: the story of the fortress's design, armament, and the evolving battlefield that shaped its reputation. The B-17's journey from early concept to wartime icon was a story shaped by both engineering ambition and operational necessity. When Boeing designed the aircraft in the mid-1930s, they envisioned a long-range bomber capable of defending itself without relying on fighter escort. Early models, the B-17B and B-17C, carried far fewer guns than their later counterparts, but combat experience, especially in the Pacific, forced designers to rethink almost every aspect of defensive armament. By the time the B-17F entered large-scale service, additional gun positions had become standard. The Bendix chin turret, enlarged waist windows, improved top and ball turrets, and twin-gun mounts that transformed the aircraft into a machine bristling with firepower. Each modification aimed to address a specific vulnerability. Head-on attacks by German fighters exposed the early B-17's weak frontal defenses, so engineers added the powered chin turret. The waist gunners, once positioned across from each other, suffered cramped conditions and accidental collisions when firing, prompting the redesign to staggered positions. Even the tail received attention. German pilots often targeted it to disable the aircraft's stability, leading to reinforced armor and improved sighting systems for the tail gunner. These adjustments did not make the bomber invulnerable, but they significantly increased the volume and coverage of its defensive fire. Still, even the most heavily armed flying fortress depended on formation discipline. A B-17's guns were never meant to operate in isolation. A single bomber had blind spots. A combat box removed them. The idea was simple. If each aircraft covered the gaps of another, the formation became a wall of lead that no fighter could penetrate without unacceptable risk. American crews spent endless hours training to maintain the tight, precise spacing required. A wing dropped a few degrees too low, a throttle adjustment delayed by seconds, and the protective geometry unraveled. German pilots understood this intimately, and they focused their attacks on stretching and breaking the boxes. The Luftwaffe of 1943 was an air force accustomed to shifting its tactics quickly. After years of defensive fighting against the RAF, it had refined interception procedures into a near-scientific process. Radar stations along the Dutch and French coasts detected incoming bomber streams early enough to direct fighters to their predicted flight paths. Staffel and Grupp formations concentrated along these corridors, waiting for the USAAF to cross the hostile threshold. The German intent was not simply to shoot down bombers, it was to disorient them. A few well-placed attacks could scatter the leading formation, forcing individual aircraft to drift away from the main body. Once a fortress fell behind, its chances of survival diminished drastically. Early USAAF missions had proven this pattern. In August 1942, the first tentative raids over Europe demonstrated both the potential and the danger of unescorted daylight bombing. German fighters pressed hard, testing the defenses of the new American arrival. By early 1943, as the raids pushed deeper toward industrial targets in Bremen, Essen, and Kiel, the 8th Air Force found itself in increasingly fierce encounters. The defenders no longer underestimated the incoming formations. The reputation of the Flying Fortress, admired for its toughness, challenged German pilots to refine head-on tactics, massed fighter attacks, and even the use of rockets and heavy cannon pods to break apart the American boxes. The strategic logic behind the USAAF's campaign remained unchanged. Crippling Germany's industrial output required daylight accuracy. But the deeper the missions went into Germany, the longer the bombers remained without escort coverage. P-47s and early P-38s lacked the range to follow the formations all the way to major targets such as Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen. The Luftwaffe exploited these gaps mercilessly. Crews on both sides understood that once the last escort fighter turned back, the battle truly began. This imbalance set the stage for some of the most punishing raids of the war. Bomber crews prepared themselves mentally for the moment the sky emptied of friendly fighters. German pilots waited for the same moment, knowing that a tight bomber stream could be unraveled by minutes of concentrated pressure. Every mile deeper into Germany increased the tension. Every mile on the return trip brought the exhausted airmen closer to safety. And within this widening gulf between doctrine and danger, the human, tactical, and technological angles of the fortress story began to intersect, shaping the dramatic turning points that followed. Angle A, the human dimension. For the men inside each B-17, the aircraft was less a machine and more a fragile world suspended in hostile air. They lived in a space barely large enough to move, surrounded by aluminum skin no thicker than a coin. Their breath crystallized inside oxygen masks. Their gloves stiffened from cold so severe it could freeze exposed skin in seconds. Yet they learned to work with it, accepting that discomfort was just another part of survival. Every mission began with silent rituals, checking lucky charms, tapping metal frames for reassurance, folding letters into flight suits. Fear was constant but managed quietly. Each position in the bomber functioned like an organ in the body. The navigator hunched over charts in the dim glow of a small lamp. The bombardier lay prone in the plexiglass nose, watching Germany emerge below like a map drawn in smoke and ruin. Gunners rotated turrets until the aircraft felt alive with movement. Even when the engines were steady and the path clear, no one felt secure. They had seen too many formations torn open. Despite the fatigue and the losses, crews formed bonds that few could understand. Trust became a survival mechanism. A waist gunner knew the man opposite him would fire at exactly the right moment. A pilot knew his flight engineer would catch the slightest vibration before it turned into disaster. Every mission reminded them that their fate hung on teamwork so precise it bordered on instinct. And yet, behind the discipline and professionalism, every man knew the truth. If the formation broke, they would be alone in a sky filled with enemies. That knowledge shaped their actions long before the first fighter appeared. Angle B, tactical reality of formation defense. The combat box was often described as a fortress in motion, but its strength rested on the discipline of dozens of crews flying as one. The idea was simple in theory, interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach angle. In practice, it demanded near-perfect flying at high altitude under constant pressure. Pilots had to hold formation through turbulence, evasive maneuvers, and sudden dives caused by attacking fighters. A momentary lapse could widen a gap by yards, and yards were enough for German pilots to slip inside the formation's defensive shield. Gunners, too, faced their own tactical complexity. Their weapons were powerful but imperfect. Machine gun sights fogged over, ammunition belts jammed. Vibrations shifted firing arcs. A ball turret gunner suspended below the fuselage rotated constantly to track approaching fighters, his world reduced to metal frames and distant flashes. The top turret gunner straddled the aircraft's spine, pivoting between protecting the lead element and covering lagging bombers. The tactical objective of every crew was simple: stay in formation. A damaged aircraft that couldn't maintain altitude or speed became easy prey. German fighters looked for these signs: trailing smoke, wavering wings, slowing engines. The moment a B-17 fell behind the formation, even by a few hundred yards, it transformed from fortress to target. For all its complexity, the formation defense system worked when intact. German pilots described the first attack runs as flying through a storm of tracers, each line of fire stretching outward from the formation like spokes on a wheel. But no formation stayed perfect forever. Weather, flak bursts, and maneuvering under fire created turbulence that rippled through the boxes, disrupting the delicate geometry. And once disrupted, recovery rarely came quickly enough. Angle C, the technological edge and its limits. The B-17's armament was the result of thousands of hours of engineering adaptation, battlefield observation, and field modification. By the B-17G variant, up to 13.50 caliber machine guns covered nearly every approach. Combined with armor plating, self-sealing tanks, and rugged construction, the aircraft had a reputation for endurance that became legendary. Crews believed in the machine, and much of the American public believed in it too. The Fortress could take punishment and still bring its crew home, sometimes on 3 engines, sometimes on 2, occasionally on 1. Yet technology was only as effective as the conditions allowed. High-altitude cold strained weapons and mechanisms. Gunners rotated stiff turrets while ammunition belts froze on exposed metal guides. Gun sights occasionally frosted over at the worst possible moments. Even the protective armor had limits. It stopped glancing rounds, but could not withstand direct hits from the heavy cannons German fighters increasingly used. The Luftwaffe introduced modifications like underwing 20 pods, 30 Mk-108 cannon, and even rocket projectiles designed to break up formation integrity. Flak, high-velocity anti-aircraft fire, created another dimension of technological challenge. While the Fortress's armor helped reduce fragmentation casualties, structural hits could shear through beams or sever hydraulic lines instantly. Crews often reported the eerie sensation of a bomber suddenly flying loose, its controls soft or unresponsive. In such moments, technology offered no solutions, only hope that the aircraft would hold together long enough to escape the immediate danger. Thus, even at its most advanced, the Fortress remained a machine tested constantly at its edges. Its strengths were real, but so were the limits that German pilots learned to exploit. And those limits set the stage for the deeper strategic and moral angles that shaped the heart of the coming conflict. Angle D, leadership and strategic decision-making. Bomber operations were orchestrated at multiple levels, from squadron leaders in the skis to generals in command centers across England. Each decision carried immense weight. Group commanders had to decide formations, altitude, speed, and route. Mission planners balanced risk with target importance, calculating how far crews could fly before fuel limits, weather, and enemy defenses would converge. Orders were grounded in doctrine, but real-world conditions often forced improvisation mid-flight. Major General Ira C. Eaker and later General Jimmy Doolittle oversaw the evolution of the 8th Air Force strategy. Eaker championed the precision daylight concept, trusting formation discipline to minimize losses. Doolittle introduced tactical refinements, fighter escorts where possible, staggered bombing altitudes, and revised approach vectors. These commanders understood the strategic importance of each raid, yet even the most meticulous planning could falter under German resistance. One misjudged cloud bank, a delayed formation assembly, or unexpected flak could turn a carefully calculated mission into chaos. Leadership also extended to the German side. Luftwaffe commanders analyzed every incursion, studied bomber formations, and issued directives for intercept tactics. Pilots were trained not only to shoot, but to anticipate the formation's reactions. The psychological aspect, Knowing the morale of bomber crews and exploiting it was considered a tactical asset. Command decisions, in effect, shaped both sides of the engagement long before the first bullets were fired. Leadership, in this context, was the invisible framework underpinning every mission. It dictated survival and dictated sacrifice. Yet no amount of command authority could remove the stark reality that, at 25,000 feet, human skill and machine endurance were tested simultaneously. Angle E, the enemy perspective. German fighter pilots approached the flying fortress with a mixture of disbelief and strategic curiosity. Reports filtered back. Some B-17s returned with fuselages riddled yet intact, defensive gunners blazing in all directions. Early encounters left Luftwaffe pilots questioning whether the American bombers were invincible. Letters home described the bewildering overlapping fields of fire, the mechanical resilience, and the seeming coordination of entire formations. "A wall of bullets," one pilot noted, "but it was not enough to scare me entirely, just enough to make me think carefully." They adapted. Head-on attacks emerged as a preferred method, exploiting the narrower frontal fire arcs. Pilots targeted isolated bombers, trailing stragglers, or those struggling to maintain altitude after flak hits. Tactics evolved into waves and rotations, initial strikes to scatter, secondary attacks to exploit openings, and finishing strikes against damaged aircraft. The Luftwaffe also experimented with specialized weapons, from underwing cannons to air-to-air rockets, all intended to pierce the protective shell the American airmen relied upon. The enemy perspective was also psychological. Knowing that bomber crews believed in their own invulnerability, German pilots used feints and pressure to induce mistakes. They understood that fear, fatigue, and small technical failures could unravel a well-disciplined formation far faster than bullets alone. The dynamic was no longer simply men versus machines. It had become a test of nerves, patience, and tactical ingenuity on both sides. Angle F, moral and strategic implications. Beyond guns, formations, and tactics lay the moral dimension of strategic bombing. Each mission involved not only the destruction of industrial capacity, but the indirect targeting of civilian infrastructure. Bomber crews were briefed to aim for factories, rail yards, and refineries, but in practice, even precision attacks carried inevitable civilian risk. This reality weighed on pilots and gunners, especially when damage reports returned showing towns reduced to rubble alongside their intended targets. Strategic calculations influence technology and tactics alike. The more aggressive the doctrine, the higher the pressure on crews to maintain formation integrity and endure flak or fighter attacks. Conversely, every loss, aircraft, crew, or morale, prompted leadership to reconsider strategy. Moral choices and practical consequences intertwined. Sustaining daylight raids without sufficient escort risked heavy casualties, while delaying missions allowed the enemy time to rebuild and reinforce. Ultimately, the fortress represented more than a bomber. It symbolized a calculated gamble between military necessity, technological optimism, and human cost. Each angle, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, moral, interacted to shape the experience of those who flew in and against it. And as these factors converged, the stage was set for the decisive moment when the myth of invulnerability would be tested in the air and measured in lives. The preparations, the human courage, the tactical innovations, and the emerging enemy adaptations all led inexorably to the first missions that would reveal the flying fortress's limits and define the turning point of the air campaign over Europe. October 14, 1943. The sky above Schweinfurt, Germany, was a cold expanse of pale blue, punctuated only by the distant trails of the formation's contrails. At 7:45 a.m., the 8th Air Force's 8th and 3rd Bombardment Divisions crossed the border, their wings casting long, disciplined shadows over the forests below. 300 B-17s in tight combat boxes, each a bristling fortress, advanced toward the city's industrial heart. Ball-bearing factories, the lifeblood of German war production, lay ahead, vital yet heavily defended. As the bombers approached, German radar stations had already scrambled over 200 fighters. Bf-109s and FW-190s climbed rapidly, lining up for the assault. The first wave struck head-on, cannon fire piercing the cold air, tracers crisscrossing in sheets of deadly light. Fortress gunners opened up, unleashing the combined fury of their 16 guns, barrels flashing in perfect timing, cutting through the first fighters like a wall of lead. Yet despite the ferocity of the defensive fire, the Luftwaffe pilots adapted. Flares marked the gaps in formation coverage, and waves of attackers exploited them with precision. Engines roared, tracers zipped past fuselages, and explosions tore aluminum wings apart. Within minutes, the formation began to fracture. Some B-17s veered off to avoid collisions, others slowed, struggling with damage to engines or hydraulics. Each disruption exposed a new corridor for the fighters, amplifying losses. Inside the bombers, fear and resolve blended. Gunners shifted positions instinctively, tracking attackers with split-second decisions. Pilots countered dives, rolled wings, and issued evasive commands, all while keeping bombs on course for their target. Crews reported smoke from neighboring aircraft, felt the shudder of near misses, and witnessed friends fall silently from the sky. The combat box, once considered an almost invulnerable shield, was showing its limits under the combined weight of numbers, skill, and relentless pressure. By 9:20 a.m., the bombers reached Schweinfurt. Bomb bays opened over the factories, releasing tons of explosives with near-mechanical precision. Fires erupted on the ground, belching black smoke into the morning air. Yet the cost in the sky was staggering. Dozens of fortresses had fallen behind, their guns silent, their crews praying for survival as fighters circled, ready to exploit any remaining weakness. The myth of invincibility had collided with a harsher reality. Even the flying fortress, for all its guns and armor, could be overwhelmed. The intensity of the German attack did not relent after the bombs dropped. On the return flight, exhausted crews faced flak batteries along the rivers and additional fighter interceptions, taking advantage of damaged or isolated aircraft. Those who survived counted the cost in quiet disbelief, noting which formations had held and which had splintered under pressure. The fortress had defended itself, but only barely. Its reputation remained impressive, yet now it was tempered by the reality that courage, coordination, and luck were as essential as technology. Among German pilots, the attack was both a shock and a validation. Reports back to command highlighted the formidable defensive firepower, but also noted the vulnerabilities, stragglers, mechanical failures, and weather-induced disorientation. Lessons learned on October 14 would shape tactics for months to come. Head-on attacks, massed waves, and coordinated interceptions became the new standard. The fortress was no longer untouchable. It was formidable, yes, but now fully understood, and it would be met with carefully calculated aggression in every subsequent mission. As the surviving bombers limped home over the North Sea, their crews carrying the fatigue and grief of those who had fallen, the stage was set for the next pivotal realization. The limitations of formation defense, the evolution of fighter escort, and the eventual tipping point that would force both sides to adapt fundamentally. The high-altitude ballet of destruction, courage, and mechanical precision had revealed both the strength and fragility of the flying fortress, and the war in the skies over Europe would never be the same. The day after Schweinfurt, the statistics were stark. Out of the 291 bombers that had penetrated German defenses, 60 were lost, nearly 1 in 5, a casualty rate that sent shockwaves through the 8th Air Force. Hundreds more returned damaged, their aluminum skin shredded, engines smoking, and control surfaces barely responsive. For the first time, crews and commanders confronted the full reality. Even the flying fortress, the invincible bristling machine, could be broken by concentrated, skilled opposition. Immediate consequences rippled through the bomber groups. Squadrons took stock of aircraft, counting not only the mechanical damage, but also the human toll. Airmen who survived bore the psychological scars of witnessing comrades fall in flames or seeing entire wings torn apart in seconds. Reports from gunners described tracer fire enveloping their own planes, the impossible coordination of enemy attacks, and the sensation of fragility despite the fortress's protective reputation. Many wrote of shock, fear, and relief, sometimes in the same breath. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, recognized that the high cost of intercepting formations was not inconsequential. Pilots were often lost or wounded even as they inflicted damage, and the rapid evolution of American escort fighters loomed on the horizon. Still, the attack over Schweinfurt had demonstrated that, under precise execution, the fortress could be brought down. German fighter doctrine evolved immediately. Interceptors now focused on creating openings in formation geometry, exploiting weather and mechanical failures, and using coordinated waves to maximize efficiency. Mission after mission, these tactics inflicted increasingly heavy losses on the 8th Air Force, underscoring the need for a recalibration of American strategy. The USAAF command learned painful lessons. Formation defense, while effective under ideal conditions, required reinforcement through long-range escort fighters. The previously assumed invulnerability of the B-17 was now tempered by evidence and experience. Leadership meetings reviewed each raid meticulously, analyzing flight paths, altitudes, formation integrity, and the timing of enemy attacks. Recommendations flowed quickly: staggered bombing altitudes, revised rendezvous points, and more stringent maintenance checks to reduce in-flight mechanical failures. Doctrine was no longer just theory. It had to accommodate the brutal realities of combat, where even a single broken engine could doom a crew. Industrial consequences were also apparent. The Luftwaffe's effective defense ensured that not all targets were destroyed in one strike. Factories continued to produce components, albeit at a reduced pace, and civilian morale fluctuated as cities bore the visible scars of destruction. Reports sent back to London and Washington detailed both the partial successes and the heavy attrition, reinforcing the strategic imperative to continue the bombing campaign, but with significant operational adjustments. Mission planners faced a new calculus: balance the destructive potential of precision bombing against the human and material cost of each sortie. At the personal level, survivors carried memories that would shape their entire view of aerial warfare. Letters sent home spoke in measured tones of heroism and terror, of friends lost and miracles survived. Veteran crews who had flown Schweinfurt and Regensburg described the day's events in meticulous detail, emphasizing the coordination required to hold formation, the suddenness of attacks, and the sheer physical strain of manning guns for hours at high altitude. These accounts contributed to a growing historical record, later referenced by historians and documentarians seeking to capture the lived reality of strategic bombing over Europe. The first phase of the aftermath, then, was a reckoning, a moment of clear-eyed evaluation of what the flying fortress could achieve and where it was vulnerable. Tactical innovation, psychological endurance, and technological adaptation all became central concerns. The war in the air had demonstrated both human courage and mechanical limitation, setting the stage for further evolution in strategy, escort integration, and mission planning. As 1944 progressed, the lessons of high-casualty raids began to reshape the daylight bombing campaign. The 8th Air Force integrated long-range P-51 Mustang escorts, dramatically extending protective coverage deep into Germany. The combination of fortress guns and agile escort fighters altered the balance in the sky, reducing bomber losses and allowing formations to complete missions with greater precision. Where Schweinfurt had been a harrowing crucible, subsequent raids demonstrated that adaptation, technology, and tactical evolution could mitigate, but never eliminate, the inherent risks. For the Luftwaffe, attrition became an increasingly critical problem. Experienced fighter pilots, many of them aces who had mastered attacks on the B-17, were lost in engagements where American formations now had both defensive firepower and escort support. Replacement pilots, often younger and less trained, faced overwhelming odds against disciplined formations protected by Mustang escorts. The German air war, once confident in its ability to disrupt bomber streams, now contended with a formidable synthesis of Allied air power, heavy bombers, coordinated formations, and extended fighter coverage. Strategically, the consequences were profound. The attrition of Luftwaffe pilots and aircraft weakened German defensive capacity over time, enabling the Allies to maintain sustained pressure on industrial centers. Targeted factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks were progressively degraded, straining the German war economy. Mission after mission, the fortress's limitations, initially exposed in devastating raids, drove innovations in escort tactics, formation management, and gunnery training. The United States Air Force, by necessity, became both more cautious and more precise, balancing mission objectives against the cost in lives and aircraft. At the human level, the psychological imprint endured. Airmen who had survived the harrowing deep penetration raids returned home with scars both visible and invisible. Stories of survival circulated among new crews, shaping expectations and training culture. Veterans emphasized the importance of discipline, coordination, and alertness, embedding these lessons into the operational ethos of the bomber groups. The Flying Fortress, once mythologized as invulnerable, became instead a symbol of resilience under fire, a machine that could inspire courage while testing the limits of human endurance. By the summer of 1944, the air campaign had matured into a relentless rhythm: morning briefings, long flights over enemy territory, brief glimpses of the target, and harrowing returns. The B-17’s continued to press forward. Flak and fighter attacks ever present, yet the integration of long-range escorts, improved intelligence, and meticulous mission planning significantly reduced the catastrophic losses that had defined earlier raids. Strategic bombing achieved tangible results, and the psychological edge of the fortress, now informed by real-world experience, contributed to both Allied confidence and German caution. Ultimately, the aftermath of these missions revealed the dual nature of the Flying Fortress. It was powerful, technologically sophisticated, and capable of inflicting significant damage. Yet it was also vulnerable, dependent on human skill, discipline, and coordinated support. The myth of invulnerability had been tempered by experience, but the combination of aircraft, crew, and strategy continued to define the air war over Europe. The stage was set for a final reflection on what these raids, these losses, and this machine of war truly represented for history, technology, and humanity. The story of the Flying Fortress is one of ambition, courage, and hard-earned truth. It is a tale where steel and human endurance intertwined, producing moments of awe, terror, and resilience. The B-17, bristling with guns and armor, captured imaginations as an emblem of invincibility. Yet the raids over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin revealed that even the most advanced technology could be challenged by skill, coordination, and the unforgiving realities of war. For the crews who manned the fortresses, every mission was a confrontation with uncertainty. They operated at the limits of human capacity, in temperatures so low that frostbite was constant, under the weight of responsibility for comrades flying mere yards away. Their courage was amplified by the machine's capabilities, yet tempered by the knowledge that isolation or mechanical failure could be fatal. The myth of invulnerability became a nuanced understanding. The fortress was powerful, yes, but only in the hands of disciplined, coordinated crews, and only when combined with adaptive strategy. From a technological perspective, the B-17 exemplified the intersection of design, adaptation, and battlefield necessity. Each turret, gun, and armored panel represented lessons learned under fire. The limitations exposed by German tactics prompted rapid innovation, influencing escort strategy, formation doctrine, and aircraft design. In effect, the air war became a laboratory where human ingenuity and engineering were tested under extreme conditions, producing lessons that would shape modern aerial combat. And yet, beyond statistics and tactics lies the human dimension, the moral weight of strategic bombing, the psychological strain on men in the sky, and the courage that defined survival against impossible odds. The Flying Fortress was not merely a bomber. It was a crucible in which technology, human endurance, and the stark calculus of war were fused together. Its story reminds us that in modern warfare, even the strongest machines are inseparable from the people who operate them, and that the true measure of power lies in the combination of skill, courage, and adaptability. The flying fortress remains a symbol, both of what machines can achieve and of the human cost required to wield them. Its legacy endures in history, in technology, and in the quiet memory of those who look down through frost-covered glass at the world below, knowing that survival depended as much on their resolve as on the guns they fired. In the end, the B-17 teaches that no myth of invincibility can withstand the rigor of reality, but courage, preparation, and adaptation can make even fragile human endeavors formidable.